I want to talk about the biological basis for matriarchy. At the risk of being labeled essentialist, which I happily affirm, I want to cut through the elegantly detached assumptions of gender studies and postmodernism and get back to an understanding of humans as living beings in an ecosystem with all the other sentient life that shares this planet. I love the mystery of the living earth and knowing that the soil is teeming with organisms without whose cooperation we couldn't even exist, and that our bodies are similarly composed, inside and out, of these same microorganisms engaged just as we are in their endlessly complex processes of birth, death, and regeneration. We are each part of a great, inexplicable energy, continuously moving in and out through forms, eventually causing the forms to change over time in a movement we have come to call evolution. As my pagan friend Charlie Murphy expresses it in a song he wrote decades ago, it's the blood of the ancients that runs through our veins, and the forms pass, but the circle of life remains. It's this circular or cyclical understanding that seems to most powerfully characterize the worldview of ancient matriarchal cultures, such as those unearthed and described in detail by the late Lithuanian-born archaeologist Maria Gimboutas. The field of matriarchal studies has been enormously hampered by the false idea that mother-based societies, having developed so early in human cultural evolution, were therefore inferior to and inevitably replaced by patriarchal ones. This simplistic Euro-Western ideal of progress blunts the ability of most people to see things as they are and has been used for naming things wrongly throughout world history. His story. I need to change this just a little bit so I can see my paper and still. Can you still hear me? Okay. In today's very much man-made world of frightening climate change and melting polar ice caps, massive deforestation, desertification, and defilement of Mother Earth, enslavement and trafficking of women and children, overpopulation, famine, endless wars, unnatural epidemics, and drug-resistant superbugs, it simply makes no sense to hold to a linear view of evolution. The idea that we modern or postmodern humans might be the pinnacle of nature's achievement so far is just ludicrous, and I think those of us gathered together in this room can probably agree about that. What I would like to do here tonight is to unpack some cutting-edge scientific developments emerging in recent years and place them in context that goes as far back as our human beginnings and probably earlier. Besides looking again at Maria Gimboutas, I'll be focusing in particular on the revolutionary work of a woman scientist named Dr. Shelley E. Taylor, whose 2002 book, The Tending Instinct, Women, Men, and the Biology of Our Relationships, goes a long way toward corroborating the intuitions and felt understandings articulated by goddess scholars and pagans in the last 30 years. Dr. Taylor is the American scientist who decided to investigate the so-called fight-or-flight response. Until Dr. Taylor's work, all humans were presumed in an emergency or under stress to instinctually attack or else flee the dangerous situation. Taylor called into question the gender bias inherent in scientific research up to that point, under which only male rats had been tested in the laboratory and only men in human studies. Suspecting that women's responses might differ, she and her women graduate students proved it in their groundbreaking Tend and Befriend studies they performed in the late 1990s. You probably have seen Tend and Befriend, right? To seriously oversimplify their results, men under stress generate testosterone, which activates the fight or flight response, while women, in the same circumstances, generate oxytocin, the hormone present during labor and breastfeeding. which among other things has been shown to have a calming effect. Taylor writes that oxytocin, quote, leads mothers to tend to their offspring. And her studies showed that women in the face of danger bonded together with other women and gathered in the children. Thus the name Tend and Befriend. But the studies opened up much more complex functions of hormones, and Taylor's research has radical feminist implications. Although the final conclusions on the Tend and Befriend studies, as reported by the mainstream media, were fairly banal, basically saying women need female friends, in my opinion, the studies showed undeniably why women need to govern society. In my work in the Women's Spirituality Master's Program at ITP in Palo Alto, I teach a course called Archaeomythology, which is the name given by Maria Gimboutas to the interdisciplinary theoretical model and methodology she invented in the late 20th century to investigate the female-centered civilizations she discovered in the strata below those of the later patriarchal cultures. So you have to think archaeologically. Although she purposefully avoided using the term matriarchy at the time, believing it to suggest female dominance rather than the egalitarianism she was actually seeing, her work stands as a powerful support to current matriarchal studies. We know now from living people who define themselves as matriarchal that this structure always denotes, among other things, egalitarianism. To make sense of what she was unearthing in the civilizations of old Europe, Europe before the patriarchal Indo-Europeans came, Gimboutas used linguistics, mythology, folklore, folk art, folk songs, and other ethnographic techniques alongside her specialized expertise in the hard science of archaeology. Having been born into a socialist intellectual household in Vilnius, where both of her parents worked as doctors, she was exposed to local folk culture by the peasants hired by her parents to care for her. And having grown up at a time when Lithuanian activists were reclaiming the ancient folk heritage as part of a revolutionary strategy, she herself, as an adolescent, collected over 1,000 Lithuanian folk songs. As a young married woman, she had to flee from Europe with a baby under one arm and a dissertation under the other, arriving at Harvard and later at UCLA, an already renowned archaeologist. It was then that she began to bring her indigenous interdisciplinary lens to bear on the ancient material she was finding in her digs that simply did not match the weapons and male dominance so familiar from the later periods. The interdisciplinary methodology she used allowed her to include, or perhaps start from, her felt sense of the material. She single-handedly brought prehistory out of the darkness and into the light as she clarified the more than 100,000 female figurines and other artifacts that had seemed unimportant to the male archaeologists prior to her work. What we call permaculture today, for example, and we believe to be an innovative modern approach to sustainable agriculture. Gimboutas showed us our Neolithic ancestors had invented and had practiced successfully for thousands of years. When I teach archaeomythology, I try to first of all help my students to understand that there's an underlying structure in nature that supports and holds us all in place. All the people, plants, animals, stars, and planets. And that this structure is the same one that has always existed for life on this planet, even though, at this point in history, we are tampering with it at our own expense, Western science having declared nature to be inanimate and humans to be in charge of it. The recent NASA bombings of the moon, you know about that, are a perfect example of this problem. And also genetically modified foods and the toxic chemicals it takes to grow them. I work with a simple lunar template showing the 8 phases of the moon during each lunar month from new moon to crescent. I don't know if you're going to be able to tell on this because the piece I had with the labels is gone. But if you imagine at the top of the figure is the new moon, when the sun and the moon are together, and that then the moon goes out away from the sun, and in the course of the lunar month comes all the way around and back again. That's a lunar cycle. So this is a lunar template, and it has 8 phases: new moon, crescent, first quarter, gibbous, full moon, disseminating, last quarter, and balsamic. I tell you that because the 8 points on this calendar, are also used to represent the seasonal cycle. So we can go back and put winter solstice at the top and summer solstice at the bottom. And in between we have Candlemas at the crescent point, and at the first quarter spring equinox, and at the next point Beltane, then summer solstice, and so on, all the way back. And this was used everywhere. So I'll go back into my writing. It's the same 8-point template, demonstrating the monthly oscillation from darkness to light and back again, that is overlain on the yearly cycle. Okay. It's this simple round calendar that is and has been used for thousands of years to depict reality. Lipinski Vir is the oldest Neolithic site in Europe, agricultural site, that means. Yeah, not quite, I guess. Built on the edge of the Danube River. Its original design reflects this 8-point calendar cycle. So this is from the 9th millennium BCE, 11,000 years ago. And this is according to a recent archaeology book published by the museum in Belgrade. When I visited the site in 2004, now, an old man from the village brought to our group of scholars, very random, a loaf of bread in the shape of the mandala. He said it had to do with death rituals, but I mean, they just baked it at the bakery. In Peru, this 8-point mandala is called the Inca cross. We can go ahead, And it can be observed everywhere, even in the layout of Machu Picchu, the famous site in the mountains. And the women who live high in the Andes around that area wear the mandala on their hats. All different ones in different regions. The same shape in Nepal, I think we have that, denotes the grandmother goddess Ajima. And in Tibet forms the core of Vajrayana Tantric Buddhism, where it's used to invoke the goddesses of the 4 cardinal directions and the center. I mean, these are just a few examples. Finally, I show my students, by calculating their personal astrology charts, that each of us is born under one of these 8 lunar phases. It's actually the sun-moon relationship, not just the lunar phase. Bringing what may seem like an abstract teaching home and making it personal, as I imagine it is and always has been for indigenous people. Each of us is anchored here on the planet by being born in an exact time and place. And this imprint can be experienced in us as qualities defined by one of these lunar phases. So let's go back to the beginning of human evolution, to a time when we were branching off from our 2 closest primate relatives, the chimpanzees and the bonobos. Science tells us we share all but about 2% of their DNA, yet with such a small genetic difference between our species, we behave quite differently in the world. And the chimps and bonobos also behave differently from each other. We humans, with our thinking minds, our spoken language, and our inventive eye-hand coordination, are the tool makers of the planet, for good or ill. And one of our most brilliant early inventions was the ability to track time and keep a calendar. Paleolithic annotations on bones and stone artifacts show the human menstrual cycle and the waxing and waning phases of the moon. In one case, on a bone inscribed with an image of a pregnant horse, someone has even kept notations of a mare's 11-month cycle. 11 months of pregnancy. Our cousins, the chimps and bonobos, still have estrus, which means the female comes into heat and shows a little blood and when she's fertile and sexually receptive, and at that time they can reproduce. What lies behind the discovery of timekeeping and the invention of the calendar is the vacillating monthly menstrual cycle, rather miraculously synchronized with the moon, and the human female group's original cognition of this. I like to think of this cognitive process and lunar synchronization as representing the evolutionary leap to the human species. Healthy human adult females are fertile every month during ovulation, but without a show of blood. And when we bleed, like the dark moon, we are not normally fertile, a very distinct and noteworthy difference from the other primates. Goddess scholars believe that the earliest civilizations based their social organization and ritual cycles on this communal condition. The root word for ritual, in Sanskrit for instance, also means menstruation. In Greek, the word for menstruation is the word for moon, month, and mental. Earlier in Sumer, the original word for Sabbath, Sabbatu, marked the menstruation of the goddess Inanna. Gimboutas documents that birthing in Old Europe took place in the temples, along with the ritual baking of communal bread. In at least one place, that bread was baked in an oven shaped like a pregnant womb with an umbilicus as a chimney. I had a picture for you out of Gimboutas, I'm sorry, it's not here. The mystery of turning grain into bread through the oven's heat corresponded in a magical or metaphoric way with the mystery of turning the menstrual blood into nourishment for a growing child through the inner heat of the womb. This way of thinking and being is apparently as old as time itself and central to human physical and cultural evolution. The later detour into patriarchal social organization that began about 5,000 years ago with the first dynasties has spread like a virus around the world, but that does not make it natural. Matriarchy, beginning with the mother, is a concept with a biological basis in fact and reality. It names not only our evolutionary process, but how each individual life comes into the world. Patriarchy, beginning with the father, or father dominance, whichever way you want to read it, is contrived and artificial, requiring a huge infrastructure to maintain the lie. Jen Vaughn teaches that the gift is given to each of us through birth from our mothers, and that all women and men receive this same gift equally. The concept of not giving, which men learn to value and express in patriarchal society, has to be taught and learned because it is an overlay rather than being inherent or natural. Some of the most recent evidence from the studies of Taylor and other scientists thinking outside the box can be used to corroborate the theory that society was peaceful when it was matriarchal. In Neolithic Old Europe, for example, and that there are structural or biological bases for this peacefulness that can be demonstrated in the laboratory. To whatever extent we choose to bring women back into the center as autonomous agents and active leaders in our communities, to that extent, we will be working directly with peace on earth. This is not to deny that when exceptional individual women become like men in leadership positions within male-dominant groups, they tend to uphold the same values and practice similar behaviors as the men around them. I'm talking about something different, talking about, as many women have so far here today, talking about female collectivity and the hormonal influences that have potentially very powerful effects, although unseen and therefore normally unacknowledged. Oxytocin, I should check time.
You have about 7 or 8.
Okay. Okay. Oxytocin, the breastfeeding hormone I mentioned earlier, is an affiliative hormone, which appears to be, according to Taylor, both a cause and a consequence of social support. When there's a threat, oxytocin is rapidly released, leaving people to seek contact with others and thus to bonding. Remember in this quote that the people within whom this oxytocin is being rapidly released happen in almost every case to be women. Furthermore, estrogen, the female hormone, enhances the effects of oxytocin, while androgens, the male hormones, inhibit them. The female oxytocin release doesn't happen only in a crisis. The hormone is released in the company of others, and even in response to something as small as a soothing touch, thereby reinforcing itself and releasing more oxytocin. Calling it an evolutionary heritage that has selected for female friendship, Taylor asserts that women and children have literally stayed alive over the centuries because women form friendships. Here's the kind of mind-bending results that come from these studies. Quote, women get much of their social support from their ties with other women and are only somewhat benefited, both emotionally and in terms of health, from their ties with men. But they do reap many emotional, health-related benefits from their ties with women. I mean, this is not a radical feminist writing. One study on students who remained behind during a December holiday showed that the strongest determinant of how lonely they were was, quote, how much contact they spent each day with women who had remained behind. The more time a student, either man or woman, spent with women, the less lonely he or she was. The amount of time spent with men, for the most part, had no effect on either the male or the female student's mental health. I mean, I just found it kind of shocking. Deliciously shocking, somehow. The scientists concluded rather blandly, I thought, that we all benefit from women's nurturing. Taylor's writing could be situated inside a conversation on the gift economy when she reports studies showing that, quote, women's networks form an inner core of social life that may be barely visible in non-stressful times, but that leap to prominence when life becomes more difficult. That was what we heard from our African sister last night. She's not only talking about mental health, for instance. When care of infants is shared among females, they grow faster. In a chilling section on chimpanzee studies in the field, she comments on social issues rampant in human society as well. Quote, when strong female bonds are absent, males are often aggressive, even abusive, towards females. She plainly states that men themselves have come to be women's primary predators. She concludes, women who are isolated from other women are in danger. And I thought of the 70s, you know, and the radical feminist intuition smashed the nuclear family. We knew that the isolation of having our own washing machines was killing us. On the brighter side, I recall earlier studies from the 1980s showing that male partners were quite aware of when their female partners were going to ovulate or bleed, on account of the subtle emission of pheromones that clued them in. So it's like men orbit the female cycle. This suggests to me the underlying structure of ancient group rituals that evolved around collective female processes of ovulation and menstruation in sync with the moon. Studies have also shown that when a pregnant woman has a committed or close partner, a male partner, during her pregnancy, the levels of testosterone in his system drop by 30%. They stay that way until the infant is 6 weeks old, and after that, they go back to normal. So if the social organization revolves around pregnant women at the center, as it does in a matriarchal society, men in general are biologically calmed and made more nurturing by the simple effects of being in close proximity with the women. The mother's brother in a matriarchal household would certainly receive this benefit, reminding us that it is not necessary for the committed male to be the biological father. We regulate, this is a quote from Taylor, we regulate one another's biology without even realizing it, says Taylor. Clearly, science itself can be used to affirm and clarify the theories and hypotheses of those of us doing research into the gift economy and matriarchal studies. And I would like to invite my brilliant student, former student, Polly, up. Polly, where are you? To sing my favorite of all of her songs, the Blood Song.
How come when they say man, they mean man, woman, child? How come when they say man, they mean all people? How come they show the blood of Christ, the blood of war, the blood from the sliced incision? Surgery on TV every night. Well, how come they show the blood of sport? It's all the same as blood from violent video games. Movies they love to see, Hollywood stars in a bloody fight. Well, how come they drink the blood of life is red wine by the bloody meat from the butcher's vine? It's all accepted, all okay, except the blood they cannot say, except the blood you cannot say, except the blood you cannot speak, except that blood may sometimes leak. Well, the only blood they cannot show is the blood that freely, freely flows from ladies, sisters, women, girls, and me. No cut, no scrape, no knife, no gun, no wound. No cut, no scrape, no knife, no gun, no wound. No cut, no scrape, no knife, no gun, no wound. Well, it flowed before hunting, it flowed before time. Our blood revealed the gift that is the human mind. Now it's bloodshed for profit. Is our blood like gold? They created a blood debt and our families are sold. They advertise, they televise the violence and the lies, the violence, the lies. And it's all accepted, all okay, except the blood they cannot say, except the blood you cannot say, except the blood you cannot speak, except that blood may sometimes leak. Well, the only blood they cannot show is the blood that freely, freely flows from ladies, ladies, sisters, women, girls, and me. It's how we came to be all menstrual, lunar, synchrony. It's how we came to be all metaformic theory. No cut, no scrape, no knife, no gun, no wound. No cut, no scrape, no knife, no gun, no wound. No cut, no scrape, no knife, no gun, no wound. It's how we came to be all. It's how we came to be. It's how we came to be all. It's how we came to be. It's how we came to be all. It's how we came to be. It's how we came to be all. It's how we came to be.